So the genius of Jewish survival, I've been thinking about this these past few weeks, and to me it is an invitation really to think about how Jewish survival occurred, why it occurred, and it also begs the question, in order to do what? It's a question for the Jewish people writ large, but I would also say that it's a question for all of us as individuals, as we think about who we are and who we want to be in relationship to God. I'm going to start with both of you on a single question, and I'll ask, for the purpose of brevity and getting the conversation going, for just a sentence or two in reply, Rabbi Sachs. Why have Jews survived?
I think we are the people who were called after Jacob's wrestling match with the angel. He was given the name Israel, he who wrestles with God and man and survives. And to my mind, the most significant sentence in that encounter is when the angel, as dawn is about to break, says, "Let me go." And Jacob says, "I will not let you go until you bless me." And somehow we have wrestled with some of the worst persecution and suffering any people has ever known. And we have said to every tragedy, "I will not let you go until you bless me." So we are not only the people who survived, but the people who took out of every crisis some new generativity, some new creation. And out of every bad thing that happened to us, we were determined to bring a blessing out of the curse.
Simon?
Well, that's very poetically beautiful, and I don't say that skeptically at all, but inevitably, Jonathan and I were saying, actually, we come at these mighty and taxing questions from a slightly different point of view. And the more prosaically historical view is that whether through a blessing or whether through necessity, Jews really had a code of ethics as the core of their collective existence, rather than the markers of what were commonly taken to be the way to survive: power, armies, monuments, force. Which is not to say that we were not in the force and monuments business through the biblical period. we certainly were, but it was, you know, for me, if I had to take one moment out of the Bible, it would be a much less poetically profound one than Jonathan's. It would be the possibility of Uriah reproaching King David for iniquity. The possibility of a dialogue between morality and power is so central to Jewish existence. So when, as inevitably, all those markers which were assumed to be a source of strength, the list I've just mentioned, were ripped away from us, the way to survive was with everything else, was with reflection, spirituality, and ethics. And, you know, on and on through generation and generation, right to this moment in Israel and in the Galut, in the diaspora now, that same argument between power and not power, power and... I'm not saying that it's a zero-sum game. That still goes on, I believe.
If I can just add to Simon, I think, Simon, my favorite anti-Semite is Nietzsche, because he was, that rarest of things, an original anti-Semite. Everyone else hated Jews because they rejected Christianity. Nietzsche hated Jews because they created Christianity.
Voltaire too, actually. Yeah. Voltaire too.
And to my mind, Nietzsche framed the choice, which Simon has rightly laid before us, because Nietzsche's philosophy was based on the idea of power. And the Jewish choice was always the power of ideas. And that makes us central, I think, to the human condition.
You write in a letter in the scroll the following: Moses realized that a people achieves immortality not by building temples and mausoleums, but by engraving their values on the hearts of their children, and they on theirs, and so on, until the end of time. is that ethics-based? Is that a spiritual blueprint? Is that different than a people who go through oppression and savagery and massacre and hold together, somehow hold together? What's specific about that prescription?
Well, I think, Jews came up with this sentence in the first book of the Bible that every human being, regardless of class, color, culture, or creed, is in the image and likeness of God. So Judaism created this idea of a society of equal dignity. Now, that's been a human search for a very long time. And most people, to echo Simon, have looked at it in terms of either wealth or power. You can be a communist and say we achieve equal dignity by equal wealth. Or you can be in favor of participative democracy. We have equal power. Jews knew that neither of those work. Some will always get more power than others, more wealth than others. And therefore they came up with, I think, the most radical and workable idea of an equal society: equal access to knowledge. Because with knowledge, the more you share, the more you have. Whereas with power or wealth, the more you share, the less you have. So I think we became the people whose citadels were schools, whose heroes were teachers, and whose passion was study and the life of the mind.
Yeah, again, I think I'm going to spend the whole evening really just footnoting Jonathan, which is a good thing to be able to do. I couldn't agree more, but so my little footnote here is that the Jewish inquiry is an inquiry which, again, the classical world does produce too, especially the classical world as rediscovered by the Renaissance, where it looks in a mirror and says, what is it to be human? What is it to be human? And, in much of the classical world, actually outside Greece, I'm thinking of Mesopotamia and Egypt and so on, the image that is looked at is the image of the king god, the emperor with all his battalions. Jews were asked to consider the nature of humanity in terms of words, in terms of language. We now know through extraordinary kind of linguistic scholarship into the early origins of the Bible that actually vernacular Hebrew sort of precedes the writing of the Bible. Even if you push the Bible, which I rather do, I'm just a student of amazing scholars to about the 8th century, approximately the reign of Hezekiah, as a continuous set of redactable scripts. There are so-called ABCD, there are alphabetic exercises that have been discovered in the northern Negev, going back to the 11th and 12th century BC, which is extraordinary early variant on West Semitic Canaanite 22 letter. And if you think about that, it absolutely speaks to what Jonathan's just said. It is very hard to master hieroglyphic language or to master cuneiform if you're not in a very small educated elite. 22 letters written down in an alphabet is for everyone. And a lot of those scholars, at least they persuaded me when I was researching Volume 1 of the Story of the Jews, that part of the genius of the many generations of Bible writers was to actually take the sacred texts and actually sieve it through this pre-existent earthy language. So in Judaism, it's not just a matter of kind of the sacred penumbra of mystical illumination and subservience before the God King. If you all speak and if you're all encouraged to read out loud, there's that wonderful moment, isn't there, in kind of Ezra, when Ezra reads out loud the Torah. And, Kriyat Torah is a vocal thing which presupposes...
This is around the rebuilding of Jerusalem.
It's why Jews never shut up. With a noise.
I haven't thought
And
that
in
at all.
fact, it's a tradition, of course, as Jonathan knows, all the way through. Remember, Samuel Pepys goes into that first synagogue in the predecessor of Bevis Marks, and he, like so many people, is shocked by how noisy it is. People are constantly going into the great synagogue.
Well, here's a footnote, Simon. When Prince Charles came to synagogue for a synagogue service for the first time in our shul in St. John's Wood, He sat in the warden's box during the evening service. It was the 50th anniversary of the State of Israel. And the first time a royal of that seniority has been to his service in a synagogue. And I asked him afterwards, did he enjoy it? And he said, "You do talk a lot, don't you?" So I said, "Your Royal Highness, exactly so. People say the art of conversation is dead. I say it's alive and well and happens in the synagogue when you're supposed to be praying."
The thing about, but it's in the Talmud, Jews that non-Jews, there'll be a lot here, I hope. Jews essentially communicate by agreed mutual interruption. You know, that's our basic form of, as we have already discovered.
All right, so before I get into some contemporary matters, and I want to come back to the spiritual question that we started in the green room. Simon, let me start with you. Can you describe a physical journey that you have taken as part of your Jewish life and what you learned from it?
Physical journey. Well, it's an old Jewish story. It's a story of orthodoxy wandering away and kind of return, you know, to make myself sound like a kind of errant Old Testament figure. But that certainly would be true. I grew up, is that what you want to know, David? I mean, I grew up in an Orthodox, but not Hasidic or certainly not Haredi, the word was unknown, background. But we kept kashrut, and I went to cheder. I was a cheder teacher, astoundingly, for a little bit. And so, you know, went through all that, and then, many things happened. Adolescence happened. The nuclear disarmament movement happened, Marxism happened, Cambridge University happened to be in a different way from Jonathan. Jonathan had the fortitude to resist the 60s and its manifestation in Cambridge University. But we were together at Thompson's Lane, I guess. Yes, so we were in the same shul in Cambridge, which I was there every Shabbat. So I became, I suppose, insofar as I was still Jewish in that way, and this I know interests you very much, David, a Jew of comfortable social habit, I guess you would say. And I think, you know, you were egging me on earlier on to say, but that's not enough. And it probably isn't enough, really. And then it was very, and stop me if this gets really very rambly, it probably already has. I did write a book of Jewish history called Two Rothschilds in the Land of Israel, about Edmond de Rothschild, the French Rothschild, and the Yishuv, in fact, the beginnings, really, the Chovevei Tzion, even pre-First Aliyah beginnings of the transplantation of Jews from Poland and Romania into Eretz Yisrael in the 1870s and 1880s. And there's a long story about that, which you don't want to hear. But I was the kind of historian at that stage of my life in Cambridge in the late 60s and 70s who felt that history was about writing the culture to which you did not belong. That part of history was really about a communion with people other than yourself in a different time, in a different place. And there were also, when the book came out, it was, you know, no one needs to dash out and buy it, but I have nothing to apologize for it. But my Auntie Esther never spoke to me again. I thought, I don't want to be dealing with this. So I ran away, basically, to to France, to Holland, but I had a little seminar in Cambridge, actually, which was just kind of post-biblical with a friend of mine called Nicholas Delange, who was Amos' translator and a great scholar of late antiquity Judaism, particularly of Philo. And we just had a kind of reading group. That's really, or you didn't come, did you? I don't think you did. You would have taught us. But it was it was just a wonderful thing. So it was my kind of philosophical secret, and it became more murky and more cowardly as I went on until, you know, but it was always there. I always read. I read Jonathan. I read Leo, and I read. It was a voice talking to me. And then when the BBC producer phoned me up and said, after I finished, I can't remember what it was, a series on American politics, I think it was, yeah. He said, I've got the obvious idea for you, and you're either going to run 1,000,000 miles away, or you're going to have to do it. And he didn't have to tell me what it was. And that's why. I don't know if that...
story of the Jews. No, it does.
Yeah,
it does. Rabbi Sachs, actually, Simon answered 2 questions in one, even though I only asked him the one. But that's what makes him brilliant. I'd like you, if you talk to us about your spiritual, religious background, how you grew up, but also for you, was there an actual trip, an actual journey of sorts that you learned something that was profound Jewishly?
Sure. I went up to Cambridge in 1966, by which time Simon was already a legend. He was the Eloi, the prodigy of Cambridge. He'd just been appointed the youngest ever fellow of a Cambridge college, and it was wondrous in our eyes. On the other hand, we didn't see Simon all that often, I have to say, in the synagogue, until that moment. There was a turning point, I think, in many lives, which is May, June 67.
Yeah, that's true.
Those very, very anxious 3 weeks leading up to the Six-Day War, when Israel seemed outnumbered, outgunned. Assad had spoken about driving Israel into the sea. We, who had been born after the Holocaust, thought, God forbid there's going to be a second Holocaust. And at that moment, a kind of frisson, a real sense of Jewish identity touched an awful lot of people. And the fact that Simon used to come in every day to Thompson's Lane to daven mincha with us told me, wow, if Simon's here, this is serious. So, and that, you know, when that sudden denouement, this extraordinary victory, the question then really stayed with me. Until then, I'd thought Judaism is what a small bourgeois group in Finchley kind of do with their spare time. I suddenly realized that there's history here, there's peoplehood here. All of us felt connected to people whom we didn't know 3,000 miles away in a country that I'd only just visited for the first time. And so that question stayed with me for a year, and I decided the next year, the summer of '68, that I was going to make a journey to discover a little more about my Judaism. And I kind of came here to the States where I'd heard that there were a lot of great rabbis. I bought a Greyhound bus ticket for $100 and went all the way around, meeting every rabbi I could think of. And I met 2 rabbis who had a huge impact, who changed my life. One of them was the late Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who had been, he was the leading Jewish thinker of the 20th century, but he'd written a doctorate on Neo-Kantian metaphysics, epistemology. He knew, he'd read everything. And from him I learnt that you can face the entire intellectual world of Europe and not be afraid. That was number one. But the really transformative impact came with my meeting Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And that was an extraordinary moment that changed my life because, you know, the first thing I did was, you know, I'm a total schlemiel, you know. I come along to America not knowing where anyone is. And I asked, where do you find the Lubavitcher Rebbe? So they said, go to 770 Eastern Parkway. I took the subway there. I walked in. I said, I've come 3,000 miles to meet the Lubavitcher Rebbe. They all collapsed laughing. They said, there are thousands of people who wait. Come back next year. You know? So, you know, I didn't know what to say. You know, I had chutzpah. That's, you know, that's number one survival mechanism. So I said, look, I don't know where I'm going to be. I'm wandering around the States, but I do know that I'll be with my aunt in Los Angeles. So if he finds and spare me a couple of minutes, please phone through to this number. One Sunday night, the call came through, the Lubavitcher Rebbe can see you on Thursday. Now, I had no money. I just had this Greyhound bus ticket. It took 3 days nonstop on a Greyhound bus from Los Angeles to 770 Eastern Parkway. And I sat for a half an hour with this great man. And I thought to myself, what does he need to waste time with a schlemiel like me from nowhere with nothing? But I found it very dramatic because after he'd answered all my questions, he started interrogating me. What are you doing for Jewish life in Cambridge? I began I was terribly English in those days. It's rubbed off since. So I began this English sentence, in the situation in which I find myself. And he cut through. I mean, he was not rude like us. He cut through in the middle of the sentence and said, nobody finds themselves in a situation. They put themselves in a situation. So if you put yourself in that situation, you can put yourself in another situation. And so he challenged me to go to Cambridge and lead. He used to have something called a Verbrengen, where thousands of Hasidim and he would speak for hours, and every 20 minutes they'd pause and they'd sing songs. And if you were about to leave, I was about to leave for the next day, and during the songs you came up with a bottle of vodka, and you poured a little in a thimble, and the Rebbe would say L'chaim, and that would be the Rebbe's vodka that you took with you into the world. So I go up to the Rebbe in front of thousands and thousands of Hasidim. And instead of doing what he normally did, it was say L'chaim, he turned to me and he said, "You're going already?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because I have to get back to university." He said, "The Cambridge term doesn't begin till the middle of October. I think you should stay." Now, how he knew, I don't know, but he stayed. I stayed. I said, "I can't stay, because it's a charter flight and I can't." So the next morning, they kind of kidnapped me. They locked me in a room. I said, "How am I going to get back?" They said, "We'll tell the airline you're ill." I said, "How am I ill?" They said, "Tomorrow we'll take you to the Rebbe's doctor and he'll find what's wrong with you." And so I got to spend Rosh Hashanah with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, heard him blow shofar. I mean, it was a transformative experience. Why? Because in Cambridge, I met very, very brilliant human beings. In the Lubavitcher Rebbe, for the first time, I met a holy human being. And that, to me, was very powerful.
Why is it so hard for Jews to talk about God and spiritual life, Simon? About personal relationship with God?
Well, you can hear your own, your own wonder about that, amplified by my massive silence as you put it like that. We're not a confessional, well, at least I've never felt Judaism to be confessional. I think Jews argue about God, and they argue with God in the Bible, famously. And but the sense actually, well, at least I never had a very strong mystical sense. I mean, of course, there is Kabbalah, and there is a certain kind of Hasidic mysticism, and all that's very important. But I don't know. I mean, I belonged and grew up in a kind of more discursive, argumentative, verbally interrogatory kind of Judaism, and a huge amount of Judaism. We read the Mishnah and the larger Talmud, really, is about life on earth, right. Really.
And understand, my question is more about my own spiritual longing. It's certainly not a judgment. I mean, because for you and for so many others, there's great satisfaction in that. But it's a question for me, because I do think that so much of you find it in the scripture, you find it in our liturgical life. There is a very personal conversation with God, but I think in modern Jewish life, in my life, growing up as I have, and in my community, I find that it's more absent.
Well, let me try a slightly different tack. I think actually, we've really broached this a bit, actually, and that's to say, first of all, God does not have a face in Judaism, as he does in Christianity. The notion of God as something that can be really embodied, as in the Christian tradition, is I was going to say abhorrent, that's too extreme, but it's certainly alien to the Jewish tradition. So the manifestation of God is in a set of teachings, and the teachings are overwhelmingly about how to comport oneself in this world. I think that's part of it, I think, actually.
Rabbi?
I think
Jews seek God's face.
Yeah.
We seek God's face in our tradition.
We seek God's face. Psalm 27 says so. I think Jews were, until relatively recently, the God-intoxicated people. I don't think there are any more profound conversations with God than in the book of Psalms. I don't think there are any more passionate love songs about God than the Song of Songs. I mean, it's extraordinary that anyone put that book in a canon of sacred scriptures, and that this is, I mean, the eros is part of what it means to love God in Judaism. This is a passionate longing. And I have this feeling that something happened around 17th, 18th century. Somehow exile had gone on too long. We say in our prayers, because of our sins, we were exiled from our land. God says through Moses, return to me and I will return to you. For 16 centuries, Jews were the most pious people. They were not the people of the biblical age constantly tempted into idolatry. Yet wherever they went, they raised up scholars, they built yeshivot, they were fastidious in keeping the commands, and somehow redemption never came. There was a tidal wave of messianic longing around the time of Shabbatai Tzvi in the 17th century, and that was disappointed. And then, this huge, this gift by the Europe of enlightenment and emancipation, which is, play down your Jewish identity and become one of us. And I think Jews made the terrible mistake, I have to say, of opting for that bargain rather than keeping their faith. Because number one, all that enlightenment and emancipation led really to the worst anti-Semitism we have ever known, and to the worst human catastrophe we've ever known. And it also became something very problematic because anti-Semitism in the 19th and early 20th century became something not only out there, but something also in here. Because for centuries, millennia, Jews had seen their reflection in the eyes of God. And they had defined themselves as a people loved by God. When they lost faith, and they first encountered anti-Semitism, they stopped defining themselves as the people loved by God and came to the conclusion that they were the people hated by the Gentiles. And out of that, there was no way out. And it was a terrible moment. So I happen to believe that you keep your faith whatever happens, because somehow or other, when you're drowning, you reach your hand up to heaven, and sometimes God grabs hold of that hand and lifts you. And that's my personal experience.
Well, this is a very shocking thing to say about the Enlightenment, actually. Here we're going to disagree. I think it's terrible to blame anti-Semitism on the naivety of someone like Moses Mendelssohn. I'm putting words into your mouth a bit, but let's say he's a classic example of a maskil. And what is so deeply moving about Jerusalem, Moses Mendelssohn's great work, is that he presupposes, and I know what happened to his family and generations on, it's true, but he presupposes with the greatest blessed optimism that Jews can live out in the world without sacrificing their Judaism. And we're here in America, Jonathan, which is the product of Enlightenment optimism.
I'm not critical of the Enlightenment, Simon. I'm saying the Enlightenment was a flight from particularity. And what we saw is the 18th century, the age of reason. In the 19th century, the return of the repressed, romanticism, nationalism, and so on. So I'm not at all critical of the Enlightenment. We would never... the Enlightenment was one of the great blessings of European culture, and I'm not negative about it one little bit. Let us see the Enlightenment as a great blessing, but let us be Jewish enough to know that every great blessing comes with a dark side as well.
Simon, can I pick up?
But you know, the venom of anti-Semitism, since we've raised music, is the Wagnerian moment, is Das Judentum in music.
1851.
Right? So absolutely. So it's the overthrow. It's what happens. Jews from Manasseh ben Israel, earlier from Simone Luzzatto, from Leone Modena, through to, from the Venice ghetto, we're commemorating 500 years of that next year, through, the age of the Maskil, was an intense struggle to find how Jews can live in the world where they're not only Jews.
Sure.
It's great to live surrounded, if you're the Lubavitcher Rebbe, by your followers and in a community of completely shared belief. But a majority of the people here, maybe not a majority, are living out in the world along with non-Jews. The comradeship between Moses Mendelssohn and Lessing was a great moment in the history of Jewish life.
I think that Lessing's Nathan the Wise, which was his tribute to Mendelssohn, is one of the high points, one of the greatest contributions in the Enlightenment. It is an extraordinary statement of religious tolerance, way ahead of its time, still relevant today. And all I'm saying is this, Simon. I believe Jews must go out into the world. I've written books about this. I believe it. I've done it myself. I believe that to remain confined within the ghetto is a betrayal of what we're here for. In the first words of God to Abraham, he says, through you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. I think we've got to go out there. We've got to be engaged with the intellectual currents of our time, with the social issues of our time. I think we've got to be there. The only thing on which I disagree with the assumptions of the Enlightenment is that the Enlightenment was universalism. We're all the same, which meant the Jews had, in effect, to be secular Marranos.
But Mendelssohn doesn't say that, does he?
No.
He actually, what is special about Jerusalem is that he says, well, shall we let him say something? I guess it's really... Go on, Tim.
He's the token American.
Oh my gosh, I'm so flustered. I'm spilling.
It's all right.
It's all right. I just wanted to steal the show. No, how do you see the crisis of anti-Semitism today? Is it different from this period that you've studied? The post-Enlightenment period of the lie of assimilation in Europe and the anti-Semitism that occurred then. What are we seeing today? How would you describe it? Is it a crisis? Is it something less?
Well, it's a horrible marriage between the kind of, the poisonous venom, which will not go away, of classic post-Enlightenment anti-Semitism, that instead of Jews being accused of the blood libel, although they do go on being accused of committing the blood libel, Damascus, 1840, the Baylis trial in the early 20th century, the vampirism of which Jews were supposed to be guilty was capitalist vampirism, wasn't it? That was, Edouard Drummond, those terrible things. So if you read, if you can bring yourself to read the obscenely vile charter of Hamas, you're redeemed only by its comic lunacy when it says be on your guard against Jews because they dominate Lions clubs and Rotarians, not any Rotary club I've ever been to. And so there are the kind of inadvertently idiotic things, but them swallowing the protocols of the Elders of Zion, hook, line, and sinker. Probably more people through the web now believe in the protocols of the Elders of Zion than at any other time since the forgery was made. But I said it's a marriage between that and ferocious anti-Zionism. Ferocious anti-Zionism. So I do think that kind of a lot of the, what Benjamin Netanyahu said, everybody should go to Israel, leave Europe, it's the end of the road, that I could not disagree with more. Part of actually what Jews are, I don't know, what I think Jews should be doing is actually bringing the long history of Jewish experience, the high points as well as the low points. For instance, give you one thing, example. Zionism is grotesquely caricatured as an entirely alien colonial incursion into a Muslim, Arab, indigenous world, as though there was, from the Bible to the 20th century, no Jewish history with any roots, with any living presence in Eretz Yisrael. No one's heard of Safat. They don't know about Luriadic Kabbalah, any of that long history. You tell people there was a Jewish majority in Jerusalem at the turn of the 20th century, they think you're kidding or lying or both. So there is you know, one of the things that sort of has to be done in addressing non-Jewish audience is, and this is an Enlightenment ideal, is essentially educational. And I would say that yeah, there are so many difficult aspects, because actually part of the murderous virulence which starts with anti-Zionism and then morphs into the kind of idiocy seen in the Hamas Charter is a result of the blowback of the death of empire. So we have large Muslim populations of disaffected and often disadvantaged young people all over Europe who buy into the crude equation.
And Rabbi Sachs, you wrote in the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago, the notion that Israel's foreign policy or national security policy is hatched in a kosher supermarket in Paris is lunacy. That's anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
How are these two forces, though, linked in a way that makes this a unique threat?
Well, look, first of all, let's just, the first thing is the Jewish way of never being too intimidated is to make a joke out of it. So my favorite story is these two Jews in Vienna in a coffee house in 1933. One is reading the local Jewish newspaper, the other is reading the notoriously anti-Semitic rag called Der Stürmer. And the first one says, how can you read that? That's full of anti-Semitic vile poison. And the second one, with a big smile, says, when you read your newspaper, what does it say? The Jews are arguing, they're divided, they're assimilating, they're disappearing. When I read mine, what do I discover? Jews control the banks, they control the media, they control the world. He says, no, if you want the good news about the Jewish people, always read the anti-Semites. The real question is this, and it's an interesting question. Anti-Semitism is a virus. Europe, after the Holocaust, created, it's the most sophisticated and complete attempt ever to strengthen the European immune system so that it could never be exposed to the virus of anti-Semitism again. 50 years of anti-racist legislation, 50 years of interfaith dialogue, 50 years of Holocaust education. And somehow or other, what a virus does to defeat any immune system is to mutate. So in the Middle Ages, Jews were hated for their religion. In the 19th and early 20th century, they were hated for their race. Today, they are hated for their nation state. That is a major mutation. The other thing that happened is you can cure an epidemic within a given population, but you are seriously in trouble if it spreads to another population. So while Europe was curing itself of the virus of anti-Semitism, meanwhile, the Arab and Muslim world was getting infected by an anti-Semitism that was strictly European. And Simon's alluded to both elements of it. Number one, the blood libel. I think as Brits we have to admit the blood libel was created in Britain.
In England, yes.
In Norwich in 1144.
Lincoln.
And in 1983, the Syrian defense minister, Mustafa Tlass, wrote a book called The Matzah of Zion, explaining why Israelis kill Palestinian children to use their blood to make matzah. In 1991, the Syrian representative at the United Nations Commission of Human Rights asked every member of the UN Commission on Human Rights to read the book so they would understand what was the nature of Zionist racism. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, exposed as a forgery by the London Times in 1921, was taken into the Arab world by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who spent the war in Berlin, working for the SS. And it has been, it is a major text, and as Simon said, incorporated in the Hamas Charter. Egyptian television did a 40-part adaptation in 2002. Syrian television did a 40-part adaptation during Ramadan in 2003. So the blood libel and the protocols have infected a world that didn't know these particular libels.
Are you offended by the notion of what Netanyahu said, that Jews should leave Europe?
I'll tell you the irony, and it's a very important one, that there is one huge difference between anti-Semitism now and anti-Semitism in the 1930s. Today, we have, thank God, a state of Israel. We have a home, in the Robert Frost sense, of the place where when you have to go there, they have to let you in. And therefore, it is not only Jews in Israel, but it is Jews in Europe who can say, I am not homeless, therefore I refuse to be intimidated. I am going to stand and fight. And Israel has changed Jewish life for those inside and for those outside.
Yeah. Simon, there's a moment.
Yeah, I couldn't. That's beautifully put. It has had that mutually nourishing effect.
Right.
I'm just concerned, really, that it's, that it's not seen as a zero-sum game. And we're two very English, even though I've lived half my life in the United States. You're hearing two very English voices here. Because people constantly ask me, I don't know if they ask you, Jonathan, is it all over in Britain as well as France and so on? And you want to make a distinction. The most venomous anti-Zionism, anti-Israeli hostility, which exactly as you beautifully put it, sort of mutates into a more traditionally odious anti-Semitism in Britain, in my view, is in the chattering classes, as we call them in Britain, is actually in the world, this doesn't make it less distressing, I have to say, in the world of intellectual comment. Just 2 days ago, 100 cultural personalities, if that's not an oxymoron, in this case I think it is, signed on to a cultural boycott of Israel, including some of my friends who bloody well should know better, or ex-friends who should know better. The population at large in Britain, you're there more than I am and in every way, does not strike me as Munich, 1931, 1932, or at all. Although probably that's what German Jews were saying in Munich in 1931.
Recorded levels of anti-Semitism in Britain, and I'm referring to the latest surveys, are actually lower than they are in the United States. So you're talking about a general population that is not anti-Semitic in the slightest. But there is an additional factor which I think is incredibly important, and I already said this 12 years ago in the EU headquarters in Brussels when we had the first European conference on anti-Semitism with Romano Prodi. We've done so since with Jose Manuel Barroso and Angela Merkel. And I said, and I repeat this always, Jews cannot fight anti-Semitism alone. The victim cannot cure the crime. The hated cannot cure the hate. I will lead the fight, and I really have done this, for the right of Christians throughout the world to lead their faith, live their faith without fear. But I need you Christians to fight for that Jewish right. In Britain, we led the fight against Islamophobia, but I say to Muslims, you must help us lead the fight against Judeophobia.
Simon, there's one of the really poignant moments of your series was you standing at the security barrier and kind of reckoning with what modern-day Israel represents. To Jews, to Israelis, to the concept of Jews being a light unto other nations. And when you spoke to a settler and your discomfort was evident in that interview, you wrote that the Bible is many things, but a blueprint for peace in the Holy Land it is surely not. What do you make of Israel today? What gives you hope? What troubles you?
Oh, the hope. Well, if we're talking about the internal character of Israel, the hope of, I'm always deeply moved and thrilled and astonished, actually. That last chapter in Ari Shavit's wonderful book, I think, actually. Not perfect, but none of us write perfect books except Jonathan. So I think it was very, profound about that. So I think First, you have to, as Jonathan very movingly put it, we have a home now. That is the big difference. It doesn't presuppose divided allegiance or make our home in the United States or Britain or France, wherever, compromised at all. But that is extremely important. The one figure I don't know why, I missed this out from when you asked me about my journey, was that when, 3 or 4 years before Jonathan was sitting with the Lubavitcher Rabbah, with Menachem Mendel Schneerson, I was meeting Ben-Gurion, actually, not one-to-one, I have to say, at all. And he was an extraordinary figure then. He'd retired. He was living in Sde Boker. He came to talk to a bunch of kids in Jerusalem. And then there was also the message that the only place for young Jews or Jews of any kind was to go on Aliyah and to come to Israel. But that was the kind of official speech. He always really wanted to know what Jewish life was actually like if you weren't going to do this, if you were going to put Aliyah on hold. And I was in Habonim. I was baby Zionist. I was working on Habonim kibbutz. I had that kind of sense. But the sense I had of Israel then and have always had is of a kind of combination of a sort of commonwealth built on a sense of tzedakah, on justice, rather than pure power. I don't go all the way with Martin Buber. Those were times of impossible idealism. But I'm a two-state Zionist. I always have been. And, Israel is not a monolithic place. Half of Israelis also believe that there has to be some way in which the Palestinian population and the Israeli population live side by side. And the settler was someone for whom biblical prophecy about territory, messianic redemption defined in kilometers of real estate was the most important thing. And that I think and still thought and still think is kind of profoundly misguided. But Israel is, apart from other great miracles, a true democracy in a region where democracy is not only absent, but shrinking with every day that passes.
And Jonathan, when you look at surveys around the world that show that Israel is increasingly isolated, do you worry about its path? Do you worry about the role that Israel can play as a tie that binds Jews around the world?
Look, I happen to think that Israel is an extraordinary human miracle. Israel has taken the Hebrew language, the language of the Bible, and made it speak again. It's taken a land that lay desolate for so many centuries and make it bloom again. But it has taken this scattered, shattered people and make it live again. And I think Israel is the most extraordinary thing. In terms of democracy, I call Israel a hyper-democracy. Every taxi driver is a political pundit who does better than the op-eds. And so I think Israel is an extraordinary place of creativity, diversity. There's more diversity in this tiny country than you'll find in whole continents elsewhere. And I think it's incredibly, incredibly powerful. At the same time, it's also, I say the Greeks gave the humanity the concept, and it's a very powerful concept of tragedy. And I say that because there was never an Aeschylus or a Sophocles among the Jewish people. Instead, we had an Isaiah and a Jeremiah.
Jeremiah, yeah.
And I said, Judaism is the principal defeat of tragedy in the name of hope. And what I see in the Middle East is one of those things I never expected. It is an unfolding Greek tragedy in a nation and a culture that always lived by the principle of hope. So I've always said that no Jew, knowing what we know of history, can be an optimist. But no Jew worthy of the name ever gave up hope. And it is no accident that Israel is the country that called its national anthem Hatikva. That is the song Israel sings for the world. And so I think a day will come as we see Syria, Iraq, now Libya, Yemen, and other places collapsing into chaos, into barbarisms and crimes against humanity of a kind we haven't seen since the Middle Ages. And there is Israel doing its little thing of showing that in a region of the world that never really knew democracy, you can be a successful democracy. In a country that has no natural assets except its people, you can move from a third world to a cutting-edge first world economy. At some stage, there must come a time when peace will come, if only. Well, they said about one of my predecessors, the late Chief Rabbi J.H. Hertz, who was a fairly argumentative guy. I would never come into that category at all, Simon.
No.
The Dictionary of National Biography says about Chief Rabbi Hertz that he never despaired of a peaceful solution to a problem once every other alternative had been exhausted. So I think one day peace will come, if only from exhaustion.
Let me get to some of our questions here, and we'll try to get through as many of these as we can, so maybe we'll try to be a little bit briefer.
Now you are trying to provoke us.
I'm sorry, I just thought I'd be ridiculous. What is your view of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians?
It's a very unhappy situation. I mean, incredibly unhappy situation. You know, you can't but look, actually, at what Palestinians have to go through in order, you know, for example, to get to, you know, from one bit of the West Bank into Israel to work and not feel desolate about it. But it's, as I said, it's essential. First of all, it's essential to make a distinction between Hamas-ruled Gaza and the West Bank. And as we know from the negotiations between Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, in 2008, it's possible to actually come to some sort of understanding with the Palestinian Authority, but it's incredibly difficult to do so with Hamas. But the argument, part of the argument that's going to happen in the next election will be, do we have a partner to work with or not? The treatment of Palestinians will not get better until there is kind of active political engagement on that front. I think. The alternative to accepting that there will be a Palestinian state at some point is annexation, in which case Israel has a terrifying demographic problem. And it's difficult, you know, it's not kind of doves who came to this conclusion. It's Ariel Sharon who came to this conclusion, that if Israel will remain a Jewish democracy, it can't be a Jewish democracy that annexes the West Bank.
Rabbi, again, from our audience, what role do you think the concept of teshuvah and forgiveness have on Jewish survival?
I think teshuvah and forgiveness are two of the most important concepts that Jews brought into the world. If you know, one of the problems in philosophy for 2,500 years, human free will. Are we free? Do we have a choice? You remember what Isaac Bashevis Singer said? We have to be free. We have no choice. And if I want an empirical proof of free will, I'll say it's teshuvah. You know, we can change. And that is one of the most important contributions Jews made to the world. Carol Dweck at Stanford, mindset. You know, this idea of the growth mindset. The Judah, the Yehudah, the brother of Joseph, that we meet in Genesis 37, the one who proposes selling Joseph into slavery, is the Judah who a few chapters later is the one who's prepared to stay as a slave rather than see his brother Benjamin made a slave. So when you look at the Bible, this idea that, it was when I read Emma for the first time that I suddenly read a novel where the chief character is different at the end of the novel than she was at the beginning. And I think that's this very Jewish insight. The other thing is forgiveness.
Emunah,
Pardon?
Emunah, really.
Emma and Emunah. I never thought of that. You're quite right. And forgiveness, the first recorded act of forgiveness in all of world literature is when Joseph forgives his brothers. As the philosopher, non-Jewish, I think, called David Constant, wrote a book in 2010 called Before Forgiveness, and he analyzes the fact that the Greeks didn't have a concept of forgiveness. They had a concept of appeasement, which is different for forgiveness. And again, the trouble is we didn't emphasize this enough. We let Christianity say Judaism is not a religion of forgiveness, and it's not a religion of love. Whereas when Jesus talks about love, he's quoting Torah. He's quoting V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, from Leviticus 19. And then he's quoting from Shema, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul. Now,
Plagiarizing Hillel.
Yeah. So, when I read Hannah Arendt in The Human Condition saying Christianity invented forgiveness, I find it quite hard to forgive her, but I will tell you how we have lost touch with our own deepest ideas. There's a rabbi I know, an Orthodox rabbi who teaches at a Mennonite university and works in peace and reconciliation. And he goes around the country to places where there are very few Jews, and he talks about peace and reconciliation. And he told me that he went to one town where there weren't that many Orthodox Jews, but an elderly Orthodox couple, hearing an Orthodox rabbi is coming to give a talk in the local university, sit in the front row, elderly, and he gives a lecture about love and forgiveness. And he tells me the man turned to his wife and says, he talks like a Gentile. Why did we give away our best ideas? And the finest idea we ever had was that God created the world in love and forgiveness, asking us to love and forgive one another.
I just have to conclude by saying what an honor it's been to be on this stage with both of you.
You were terrific. Good for you.
I'm privileged to learn from both of you before now and tonight. So thank you both. Thank you all for your time tonight.